Hello, I'm Phil Durst.
Hey, I'm Christian Tollini, and we are standing here in one of the corn performance variety trials in Whittemore, Michigan, which is located in Zone 4. Phil and I are extension educators. I'm on the field crops team, and Phil is part of the dairy team.
Yeah. So Christian, in this plot here, there are both grain varieties planted and corn silage varieties planted. Is that correct?
Yes, Phil, that's correct. All these varieties, they're planted on the same day. They are in replicated blocks throughout the trial, and they are all managed the exact same.
Okay, so everything gets treated the same and harvested then the same day for silage, or harvested the same day for grain.
Right. Well, when it's time to harvest the silage trials will get taken, and then the rest of the grain trial will be left to continue maturing, and then we'll come in and we'll harvest when we're ready.
So what do they look at in the grain varieties? What do they measure?
So in the grain varieties, the biggest thing that we're looking at is yield. But there are a lot of different factors. There's a lot of other things that we look at in addition to yield. We take notes on lodging. We take notes on moisture, which is, up here in northern Michigan, it's not just enough to look at the yield. We also have to know how good is a variety at drying down. So those are two of the biggest factors that we look at on the grain side.
On the grain side, basically corn is corn is corn.
More or less, yes. Yeah.
But on the corn silage side, we're producing feed for cattle, and corn silage is not corn silage is not corn silage.
Right.
There's different quality factors that they measure as a part of the corn silage variety trials that we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. So there are important differences in corn silage varieties to be considered in the context of a farmer's resources and constraints. And in dairy today, where so many farms are feeding corn silage as a high percentage of their forage, that really becomes increasingly important because we've put a lot more eggs in one basket. And so corn silage variety increases in importance.
So the MSU corn silage variety trials have 6 different measures of feed quality. 2 are about nutrient levels, which would be crude protein and starch. There are also 2 about fiber levels, which would be the NDF and ADF. And then there are also 2 about digestibility, which would be in vitro digestibility and NDF digestibility.
Okay, and so those 6 factors then are used in a model that creates 2 other factors. One's milk per ton and the other's milk per acre, and we'll talk about those later. But let's talk about those quality factor differences and how they relate to things, and we'll take one from each of those groups. Let's start with crude protein.
Looking at the 2019 Michigan Corn Hybrids Compared Bulletin.
That'd be this bulletin right here.
Yep, that bulletin right there. You can find it online at varietytrials.msu.edu. And this is where all these parameters are listed. So in maturity zone 4, where we are today in Iosco County, there were 13 silage-specific hybrids. All of our comparisons will be based on these hybrids. These hybrids represent many more by inference. That is, for example, if these hybrids had a range in 1% point in crude protein, then the others will have at least that range.
All right, so in fact, these hybrids, these 13 corn silage varieties, did have a range of 1 percentage point in crude protein, 7.8 to 8.8. Big deal?
Well, that actually is a big deal.
Okay. So it's a big deal because we're feeding so much of it. So let's just do some math. If we take a ration with 60 pounds of corn silage at 7.8% corn silage versus 8.8% corn silage, 60 pounds of corn silage as fed per day per cow, we're talking about a difference in 0.21 pounds of crude protein per day from the corn silage. Now, if we have to make up that difference in protein with soybean meal, then it takes 0.37 pounds per day of soybean meal per cow. Well, still doesn't seem like much of a difference, but 0.37 pounds of soybean meal per day per cow in a pen or a barn of 250 cows is about 100 pounds for the batch, or for the day, 100 pounds of soybean meal for the day, and for a year, for that 250 cows, is almost 17 tons of soybean meal. Big deal on a point of crude protein.
That's right.
So the fact that small differences are multiplied by the number of cows we're feeding and by the fact that we're feeding them every day really does add up.
That really is the impact of one quality measure of corn silage.
So let's talk about another of the quality factors that were measured. We said there was two factors that were component related, protein and starch, two factors that were fiber related, ADF and NDF, and two factors that were digestibility related, and we'll talk about those. But the two factors that are fiber related, ADF and NDF, that stands for acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber. Now those are just laboratory measurements, but those are related to the ability of the cow to break down that fiber in her rumen. And we'll take a look at NDF, which is neutral detergent fiber, and the reality is that the higher NDF is, the less of that the cow is able to utilize by breaking it down in rumen, which means that the higher the NDF is, the more feed gets eliminated as manure. But NDF is important. In fact, we feed corn because of fiber. And it's important that there's fiber in the ration because that fiber in the rumen will form a floating mat in the rumen on which the bacteria operate to break down the feeds that the cow eats. So that fiber is a critically important factor to the cow. However, fiber fills the cow because if fiber is high, she'll feel full and she won't eat. And if she doesn't eat, then we've reduced dry matter intake. So it's a balance between fiber amounts, fiber digestibility, and dry matter intake. In fact, in the Milk 2006 model, the dry matter intake is a factor of NDF and NDF digestibility, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that combination of fiber and fiber digestibility impacts how much the cow is going to eat.
So if we look at the results from last year's trial, we can see that the range was 8 points in NDF between different varieties, 42.3 to 34.3. That's a wide range indicating pretty big differences among hybrids.
So it's a big range in fiber. And another thing to remember about NDF is that NDF is inversely related in general to starch. So the higher the fiber level is, the lower the starch. And that's a critical issue as well. And then I think it's also important to put corn silage hybrids in the context of who's going to get the feed. When we feed early and mid-lactation cows, we want them to have a lower fiber, higher starch diet than when we feed late lactation or especially dry cows, where high fiber and low starch is just fine for those cows. So it's about matching our feed with the groups of cows that we're going to feed. That's important too.
So part of hybrid selection is knowing what cows the feed is intended for. If you can't separate feeds and have different rations, then feeding for an early mid-lactation cow is probably what you need to do.
That's right. And Jim Lynn out of University of Minnesota had a quote that I think is very valuable. He says that in general, the most profitable hybrid is the one that maximizes income over feed costs for your dairy. Well, certainly targeting the feed to cows, what the characteristics are of the feed to the characteristics of the cows is going to be a big part of maximizing income over feed cost. And then another consideration is what my colleague Stan Moore has talked about, and that is that you also have to look at your land base. Look at the land base that you have for corn silage and look at the cost of supplementation. That is simply supplementing with energy or supplementing with protein. So when land base for corn silage is limiting, or when feed cost or supplementation cost is low, it's better to feed a high fiber variety because we need the fiber from the acres and we can supplement it more easily because the cost of supplementation is low. Vice versa, if land base is adequate or the cost of supplementation is high, we can feed a very low fiber variety because we have enough acres for the fiber and the cost of supplementation is lower because we don't have to supplement as much because starch levels are higher. So that becomes an important consideration in a farmer's decision about what silage varieties to plant. So no matter what the fiber level of the feed is, it's really important that we talk about digestibility too, and that's the other two factors. NDF digestibility is one we'll focus on because the digestibility of that fiber is critical for the cow to be able to get use out of that feed.
Okay, so in talking about NDFD, in the varieties planted in last year's plots here in Zone 4, The range in NDFD was 2.7 percentage points.
Okay.
That's lower than the 7-point range among the 105-day plus varieties planted in Zone 2 and 3. Each percentage point is important.
Oh yeah. In fact, there was some great work at Michigan State University done by Mike Allen and his grad student where they looked at the relationship between digestibility and dry matter intake. And what they found was, in the paper published in 2005, was that intake increases by 0.26 pounds of dry matter for every percentage point difference in dry matter in NDF digestibility. So in that 2.7% difference, there's 3/4 of a pound of difference of dry matter intake. In the 7-point range that you talked about, in the longer varieties, a little downstate, that's a 2-pound difference in dry matter intake per day per cow, simply based on NDF digestibility. That makes a huge difference in the amount of milk those cows will produce. So that brings us to the milk per ton and the milk per acre measures from the Milk 2006 model. Right? And the Milk 2006 model takes a look at things, and it's been fairly well proven by looking at what the production is in commercial herds compared to the factors that go into this. You could view these measures as a composite trait that's used in selecting bulls. I like to think about milk per ton as being like the trait when you select for bulls of net merit dollars, combining a bunch of factors into one factor that you can look at that brings everything together.
Okay, so if we look at the case of the 13 hybrids from last year's trial, there's a difference of 277 pounds of milk per ton of corn silage.
277 pounds in milk per ton, and I like to look at milk per ton first. I think that's where I want to maximize my resources and say I want as much out of that feed as I can get out of that feed, and so that's why I look at milk per ton first. And when we're looking at the importance of corn silage variety factors, I think we have to look at this and say, what are my cows going to do on it? How is it going to feed to my cows?
So we see how important it is to really look at quality measures when selecting for corn silage. But of course, there is another factor that farmers need to consider, and that would be milk per acre, the feed value multiplied by the yield.
So that's right, and it depends on the situation for the farm. Because if land is limiting, then what we want to emphasize is milk per acre, whereas if land is adequate, milk per ton, because we're going to get the tons we need. And so it really depends on the farm and the situation. And that's why it's important to sit down with your nutritionist, for farmers to sit down with a nutritionist, talk about variety selection, talk about the factors in the variety, talk about the acres they have that they can devote to corn silage, and develop a plan that's based on matching the resources to the needs, and also look at the other agronomic factors involved in corn silage picking. I think it's just like selecting bulls. You set your standards and say, I want to pick bulls that are above those standards in the top 25% to the top third. And the same way with hybrids, we want to look at our standards and pick ones that are in the upper ranges of the factors that we want, and then add in the other factors that are important.
So these Michigan State University trials, they are a great way to learn more about options, and we encourage you to check out the results of these variety trials at varietytrials.msu.edu.
Well, let's head over to the barn and talk to the real judges of feed quality. Those cows know feed quality.
Sounds good.